You're in the cockpit of a P-47 Thunderbolt, high above occupied France. The altimeter reads 18,000 feet, standard altitude, for a fighter sweep. From up here, the view stretches for miles. Checkerboard farmland, the silver glint of the Seine, dark patches that mark German airfields far below. It feels safe at this altitude, but it isn't. In the summer of 1943, American fighter pilots were dying up here, faster than the Army Air Forces could replace them. The numbers were brutal. Between June and September, the 8th Air Force lost 214 fighters over Europe. Not to engine trouble, not from running out of fuel. They were torn from the sky by German fighters, fast a tighter turning, and flown by men who'd ruled these skies since 1940. The Luftwaffe's Bf-109s and FW-190s owned the space between 15,000 and 25,000 feet. They had mastered the bounce diving out of the sun, hammering a P-47 with 20mm cannon fire, then climbing back to safety before the American pilot even knew what hit him. Every mission briefing turned into a grim prediction. Not if someone would die, but how many. Major Ub Zemk, commanding officer of the 56th Fighter Group at Halesworth, had seen too many empty chairs in the mess hall. The doctrine wasn't working. American pilots had been trained to fight vertically, to maintain altitude advantage, to never give up the high ground. It was gospel, and it was getting them all killed. Zemke began thinking the unthinkable. What if altitude wasn't the answer? But the problem, what if the key to survival wasn't going higher, but lower? It sounded insane. Flying low meant you couldn't see danger coming. One mistake, and you'd crater into French soil. It meant flak crews could track you with ease. Every tactical manual agreed. Low-level penetration in a single-engine fighter was suicide. But Zemke looked at those 214 dead pilots and asked one simple question. Compared to what? Because this wasn't working either. So in September 1943, Zemke quietly called in 3 of his best: Captain Walker Mahir, Lieutenant Bob Johnson, and Captain Jerry Johnson. He told them to forget everything they'd ever learned about altitude discipline. On their next mission, once the bombers were clear, he wanted them to drop. Not to 10,000 feet, not even to 5,000. All the way down. Treetop level. Test it. See what happens. If they got court-martialed, he'd take the hit. The 3 pilots looked at each other. All of them had buried wingmen that month. They? Yeah, Grieth. On September 27, 1943, 3 P-47s dove from 18,000 feet to just 200 feet above the French countryside. They flew so low, French farmers leaped into ditches in fear. They were fast at 350 miles per hour. Throttles slammed forward, and that's when something unexpected happened. They spotted a German airfield near Beauvais. FW-190s lined up on the runway like toys. The Luftwaffe had no warning. The Thunderbolt screamed in at propeller height, 50 caliber guns blazing. 4 enemy fighters were destroyed before the flak crews could even man their guns. The Americans stayed low. Take a mom, 0 losses, 4 kills, and a revolution had just begun. The Americans had stolen the ground and turned it into a weapon. Physics didn't care about doctrine, and at 50 feet, physics was on America's side. The P-47 Thunderbolt was never meant to fly like this. Republic Aviation had built it as a high-altitude escort, a 7-ton beast, designed to protect bombers at 25,000 feet. Its massive R280 engine pushed out 2,000 horsepower, but all that muscle was engineered for thin air and stratospheric climbs. So when pilots began dragging these metal monsters down to treetop level in late 1943, the results were violent. They returned with shredded belly panels, damaged oil coolers, and stories of close calls that should have ended in fireballs. But something strange happened. Republic's engineers realized they had accidentally created the perfect low-altitude strike fighter. They just needed to finish the job. The first upgrade was survival engineering. Starting in December 1943, Republic began bolting quarter-inch armor, plating to the belly, and lower cowling. This wasn't about stopping bullets, it was about surviving France. At 50 feet, pilots weren't just dodging enemy fire. They were dodging trees, power lines, and their own recklessness. Branches got clipped, telephone wires got torn, and yet somehow, the planes stayed in the air. That armor turned potential crashes into near misses. After several oil coolers were punctured by debris, engineers reinforced the brackets to keep cooling systems alive through impacts. One pilot, Lieutenant Francis Gabriski, returned to base with a 6-foot tree branch wedged in his landing gear. The armor had saved the hydraulic lines. The gun sight got an overhaul, too. The original N9 reflector sight was built for high-altitude deflection, shooting leading, a moving target far away in three-dimensional space. But at 50 feet, targets didn't maneuver. They were parked aircraft, trucks, locomotives. You had 2 seconds to acquire and fire at 350 miles per hour. By February 1944, the P-47s were getting new K-14 gyroscopic sights with adjusted ranging, basically transforming the Thunderbolt into a point-and-shoot weapon. Put the pipper on the target, squeeze the trigger, and 850 rounds of 50 caliber fire erased whatever was in your sights. Wing racks were changed too. The Thunderbolt could carry bombs, but the standard mounts were meant for high-altitude drops. Drop a 500-pounder at 50 feet, and you'd be vaporized along with your target. So engineers adapted low-altitude skip bombing from the Pacific Theater releasing. The bomb at full speed, letting it bounce like a stone across concrete, straight into a German fuel depot. The upgraded P-47 Thunderbolt, which rolled out in March 1944, came with reinforced wing roots to survive the G-forces from these insane bombing runs. But the most important modification wasn't hardware, it was mindset. By April 1944, new replacement pilots arriving in England weren't just handed a plane and a helmet. They were sent to a qualification course at us. There, they learned to fly at 50 feet across the English countryside, to read the terrain at a speed where a second's hesitation meant death. They practiced 1-second snapshots at ground targets. They flew 4-ship formations at hedge height, until the fear of flying that low melted away. The instructors were veterans pilots who had survived months of combat over France. Their message was simple. Altitude kills you. Speed saves you. And the P-47 can take punishment that would tear apart any other fighter. Trust the machine. Own the low altitude. And maybe, just maybe, you'd live long enough to go home. April 8th, 1944. The day the Luftwaffe learned that nowhere was safe anymore. Colonel Hubert Zem could spend 6 months perfecting the tactic training pilots, analyzing intelligence reports on German airfields, and waiting for the weather to clear. It did, and with it came confirmation. Jagdgeschwader 2 and Jagdgeschwader 26-2 Elite. Luftwaffe wings were rotating squadrons through forward bases near Evro and Bernay. The Germans thought these airfields were safe, nestled 60 miles inland, shielded by flak and radar. They were wrong. Zemk launched a coordinated low-altitude strike involving 48 P-47s from 3 groups. The 56th, 78 THC, and 353rd. No bombers. No high-altitude sweep. Just pure treetop hunting. As the formation crossed the French coast, they split into 4-ship flights and dropped to 100 feet, then 50. French resistance spotters later said they could feel the ground shake. The first flight hit Evro airfield at 7:47. 16 Bf-109s were on the ground, some taxiing, some still being fueled, others with pilots climbing into cockpits. The Thunderbolts burst from the haze at 360 miles per hour. The German gunners never got a shot off. In 90 seconds, 11 enemy aircraft were destroyed. The Americans were already gun screaming toward secondary targets, and that was the beauty of it. Timing. The Luftwaffe's command structure depended on centralized radio control. When Evro was hit, they tried to warn other airfields, but the P-47s were already there. Bernay was hit 8 minutes later. Beaumont-Tarager, 4 minutes after that. German controllers tried to vector fighters to intercept threats that had already attacked and vanished. It was like trying to swat flies with a sledgehammer while the flies tore your house apart. By 8:20, Thunderbolts had struck 7 airfields across a 40-mile radius. The few German pilots who got airborne found themselves chasing ghosts. They couldn't see the attackers. They couldn't catch them, and flying that low, one mistake meant annihilation. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, one of Zemsey's original 3 pilots from that first September test run, led a flight that caught a staffel of FW-190s completely off guard at Konks Airfield during their morning briefing. The German pilots were still standing beside their aircraft when Johnson's Thunderbolts tore over the boundary fence at full throttle. Johnson's gun camera captured what happened next, and even 80 years later, the footage is hard to watch. FW-190s erupting in flames. Pilots dive in for cover. Fuel trucks exploding and fire spreading across the flight line like wildfire. In his after-action report, Johnson was clinical. Destroyed for aircraft on ground. Probably destroyed 2 more. Heavy damage to fuel storage. No enemy fire encountered. Time over target, 11 seconds. 11 seconds that erased 2 years of German training, maintenance, and logistics in one brutal sweep. And that was just one strike. The week-long April offensive, which American pilots had already started calling Chattanooga Choo-Choo, runs after they expanded their targets to include railroads, was devastating. In whose days, they destroyed 47 confirmed German aircraft on the ground, 23 locomotives, and countless fuel trucks. Supply depots and ammunition dumps turned into smoldering craters. The cause, 3 P-47s. 1 loss, 2 flak. 1 flew into a power line. 1 suffered engine failure on the way home. That's a loss ratio of 15-1. In favor of the Americans. Suddenly, every Luftwaffe base commander in France was demanding more flak guns, more camouflage, more anything that might stop the hedge-hopping Thunderbolts. Even in German radio intercepts, you could hear the desperation. The hunters had become the hunted, and they had no idea how to fight back. And hey, if you're re-enjoying this deep dive into forgotten tactics and wild innovation during World War II, don't forget to subscribe and hit that like button. It helps a ton, and there's plenty more coming. Generalleutnant Adolf Galland, commander of Germany's fighter forces, read the April loss reports and saw the writing on the wall. Losing aircraft in the air was expected. You could replace a plane. You could train a new pilot, but losing them on the ground along with the fuel, ammunition, and crew needed to support them. That was bleeding the Luftwaffe dry faster than the Reich's collapsing logistics could repair. On April 19, 1944, Galland issued Directive 487 to all Jagdverband commanders in France. Move aircraft dispersal points at least 800 meters away from runways. Increase flak coverage along approach pads. Establish observer networks in nearby villages. To give early warning of low-level attacks. It was a tactical bandage on an arterial bleed, and Galland knew it. The first change was flak repositioning. Luftwaffe ground crews dragged 20mm and 37mm cannons away from the airfields, placing them a kilometer out to intercept P-47s before they reached strike range. It didn't work. The Americans just flew lower, using hills and tree lines to mask their approach. By the time the flak crews saw them, the Thunderbolts had already fired and were gone, traveling too fast for guns designed to track targets at altitude. Worse, putting flak batteries in open fields made them targets. P-47 pilots started hunting the flak guns themselves, strafing their positions with 50 caliber fire. One German flak commander near Dreux reported losing 17 men in 3 weeks, without scoring a single hit. The observer network was slightly more effective but brought its own problems. The Luftwaffe recruited French civilians Zoom-willing. Others coerced to monitor roads and fields and phone in warnings. When they heard engines, it bought the Germans maybe 30 extra seconds, just enough for pilots to run away from their aircraft. The men lived. The planes still burned, but the French resistance quickly figured out the network. Within days, they started flooding it with false reports, sending Luftwaffe ground crews scrambling to defend against attacks that weren't coming, while real Thunderbolts hit different targets entirely. By mid-May, German commanders no longer trusted their own warning system. Desperation reached new levels with aircraft dispersal tactics. Instead of parking fighters in neat, efficient rows near the runway, German crews began hiding them under trees, in barns, behind camouflage netting across the countryside. It saved some planes from being destroyed on the ground, but it wrecked the whole point of having a fighter base. A Bf-109 hidden 2 kilometers away in a barn needed 20 minutes to get to the runway, refueled, rearmed, and airborne. You can't intercept anything with a plane you can't launch. The Americans had forced the Luftwaffe into an impossible choice: protect your aircraft, or actually use them. They chose protection, and so even when German planes survived the attacks, they rarely flew again. In late May, Galen tried one final countermeasure. Operation Werger. The plan called for heavily armored FW-190s, equipped with larger cannons to patrol at low altitudes and intercept Thunderbolts. During their attack runs, the theory hit the hedgehoppers when they were focused on the ground, not the sky. It failed spectacularly. The armored FW-190s were too heavy and too slow. At 50 feet, those disadvantages were fatal. In the first week of Werger patrols, the Luftwaffe lost 6 modified aircraft without scoring a single kill. The program was quietly shut down because there was no counter to hedge-hopping. The tactic didn't fight fair. It wasn't about honor or rules of engagement. It was about exploiting every weakness in the German defense system at the same time. And by the time the Luftwaffe figured it out, it was already too late. The Germans could adapt to one threat, maybe even two, but not all of them at once. By June 1944, Luftwaffe commanders in France had accepted a grim reality. Their aircraft weren't safe on the ground, weren't safe taking off, and the Americans could strike anywhere, anytime. Air superiority had become something else entirely. Air terror. Living at 50 feet meant speaking a new language, if survival one. The Luftwaffe had never learned. You could fly a perfect mission, follow every tactic, and still die because a flock of starlings exploded through your canopy at 350 miles per hour. Lieutenant James Goodson of the 4th Fighter Group learned that on May 3, 1944, when a bird strike shattered his windscreen over the Loire Valley, blood, feathers, and shards of plexiglass tore into his face. Half-blinded eyes stinging from the wind, he somehow kept the Thunderbolt steady and climbed out of the death zone. He landed at an emergency strip with glass embedded in his cheeks. The bird, a crow. After that, pilots started calling them flying flak and developed a sixth sense for bird behavior. If the bird scattered, something was there. Trees, wires, another aircraft. The birds knew the terrain better than the pilots did. But power lines were worse. You couldn't see them until it was too late. France's rural electrical grid was a deadly spiderweb wooden poles, strung with thin wires at exactly the altitude American fighters were flying. Nearly invisible, strong enough to slice through aluminum like it was paper. In April and May 1944, the 8th Air Force lost 9 P-47s, 2 power lines. Not 2 enemy fire, not even counted as combat losses. Just struck an obstacle during low-level flight. Lieutenant William O'Brien hit a line near shot. The cable wrapped around his propeller and pulled down 3 telephone poles before snapping. The jolt nearly ripped the engine off its mount. He made it 10 miles before vibrations forced him to bail out. When rescue crews found the wreck, 40 feet of copper wire was still tangled in the blades. The psychological toll of hedge-hopping wasn't fear of death. Every combat pilot lived with that. It was a fear of dying stupidly. At altitude, if you were shot down, it was honorable, a fair fight. Someone would write your mother a letter about your bravery. But at 50 feet, a momentary lapse, a missed chimney, a misjudged hill. 1 second of distraction and you became just another pilot who flew into the ground. It haunted them. In May 1944, 3 pilots from the 56th Fighter Group asked to be reassigned to bomber escort missions at higher altitude. One of them had 14 kills. He told the flight surgeon he'd rather face the entire Luftwaffe at 20,000 feet than fly another hedge-hopping mission. The surgeon approved the request without judgment. Everyone understood the physical toll was just as punishing. Flying at full speed, constantly scanning the terrain, fighting turbulence, and tracking threats pushed the human body to its limit. Your system dumped adrenaline for 2 hours straight. Eyes strained to track the ground rushing towards you at 6 miles per minute. Hands and arms fought every micro-adjustment to keep you from slamming into the earth. Pilots would land soaked with sweat savon in 50-degree weather. Some couldn't hold a coffee cup for an hour. Flight surgeons recorded cases of hand tremor so severe that pilots had to dictate their after-action reports. And then there were the ones who adapted too well. The ones who stopped being afraid, who flew at 30 feet instead of 50, who strafed in daylight when they should have passed. Overconfidence at that altitude had a 100% mortality rate. It was only a matter of time. In May, Major Gerald Johnson grounded one of his best pilots not for breaking rules, but for flying under a railway bridge. Not over. Under. He'd stopped being afraid, and at 50 feet, fear was your last survival instinct. Lose it and you were already dead. June 6, 1944. 5:30 hours. Dawn broke over Normandy and with it came the largest amphibious invasion in human history. 156,000 Allied troops stormed 5 beaches, and the entire plan hinged on one assumption: that the Luftwaffe wouldn't show up. Not couldn't, wouldn't. Because if German fighters rose to defend the beaches, it would be suicide. General Eisenhower bet the entire operation on air supremacy, and the hedge-hopping Thunderbolts were about to make good on that bet. Even before the first landing craft hit the sand, 289 P-47s were already screaming across northern France at treetop level. Their mission: wipe out every Luftwaffe base within 150 miles of the coast. The strike began at 4:45 minutes before it shot. The timing was surgical. At Creil Airfield, 35 miles north of Paris, a group of Bf-109s was taxiing into takeoff position, preparing a dawn patrol to investigate the invasion fleet radar had tracked all night. They never made it. 8 P-47s from the 78th Fighter Group materialized from the Preden haze. The German pilots, Canopius open eyes on instruments, never even saw them coming. 18 Bf-109s were destroyed in less time than it takes to read this paragraph. At Beauvais, at Abbeville. At Abbeville. The same scene repeated. German fighters burned before they ever left the ground, before they could defend the beaches that were already slipping away. And the tactics evolved in real time. These weren't simple strafing runs anymore. Fighter groups were coordinating continuous, overlapping sweeps. As one flight finished its attack, another was already inbound from a different direction. The Luftwaffe never caught a break. Radio intercepts captured chaos. German air controllers screaming contradictory orders, trying to vector fighters toward attacks coming from everywhere at once. And none of it worked. At 6:20 hours, Jagdgeschwader 26 attempted to launch a Staffel from Lille-Vendeville to intercept the invasion fleet. They got 4 fighters into the air just before the P-47s hit the field. Those 4 never made it. They were bounced by high-altitude P-51s, waiting silently above the clouds. None of them reached the coast. Because, by D-Day, it wasn't just about destroying aircraft. It was about shattering the Luftwaffe's will to even try. By 8 o'clock, as American infantry fought through the surf at Omaha Beach, the entire German Air Force had managed to put exactly 2 aircraft over the beaches, 2 reconnaissance planes. Both were shot down within minutes. Hitler reportedly spent the morning screaming at his air commanders, demanding to know, where was the Luftwaffe? The answer was simple. They were burning on airfields across France, burning in the wreckage of a strategy that had failed. That day, P-47 Thunderbolts flew 847 individual sorties. An operational tempo that should have been impossible. But this wasn't the traditional warfare. They didn't fly long, neat, 8-hour mission. They flew, landed, rearmed, refueled in 20 minutes, then went back up. Some pilots flew 4 times before sunset. Ground crews worked with such ferocity that several collapsed from exhaustion. And as the daylight hours stretched on, the mission evolved. Airfields weren't enough. Now, the Thunderbolts hunted everything that moved toward Normandy. Trains, fuel convoys, bridges, anything that could support a counterattack became a target. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Gabrisky led one such strike. His flight caught a German panzer column moving toward Cannes. The tanks were sealed up, crews inside, rolling down country roads with no air cover. Gabrisky's P-47s weren't carrying bombs. 50 caliber, armor-piercing, incendiary rounds. They strafed from above, hitting engine decks where the armor was thinnest. 3 tanks ignited, secondary explosions ripping them apart. The column scattered into the tree line and didn't move again until after dark. Now multiply that scene across 50 roads. That's why German reinforcements that should have reached Normandy in 6 hours took 3 days. By nightfall on June 6th, the Luftwaffe had flown 319 sorties over Normandy. The Allies, 14,674. That was the difference. That was hedge-hopping. Every German aircraft that managed to survive the airfield strikes still had to run a gauntlet of American fighters between their base and the battlefield. The few that got through did nothing, because the skies over Normandy didn't just belong to the Allies, they were dominated by them. And they were dominated because for 7 months, P-47 pilots had been perfecting a single mission: kill the Luftwaffe. Before it could fly, D-Day wasn't just one on the beaches. It was one at 50 feet, one burning wreck at a time, and the impact didn't end in 1944. The hedge-hopping revolution rewrote the rule book. Every Allied air force in Europe adopted some version of the tactic. British Typhoons and Tempests began flying low-level sweeps. Soviet Il-2 already purpose-built for ground attack, revised their strike patterns using American after-action reports. Even the Luftwaffe tried to copy the tactic in their last remaining sectors. But by then, they had no fuel, no pilots, no time left to learn, because the Thunderbolt hedgehoppers had proven something radical. Air superiority wasn't about altitude. It wasn't about the sky above the battlefield. It was about every inch of airspace from the treetops to the clouds. You couldn't just win up there anymore. You had to dominate everywhere. The numbers tell the story. Between April and August 19, P-47 groups flying hedgehop missions destroyed 1,823 German aircraft on the ground, 315 locomotives, over 9,000 trucks and armored vehicles, hundreds of bridges, fuel depots, and supply lines. They lost 289 aircraft in return, 114 to flak, 87 to ground obstacles or mechanical failures, 67 to enemy fighters, 21 to unknown causes. It was a brutal loss. Rate about 15%, but it was sustainable. And more importantly, The planes they destroyed on the ground never flew again. They never bombed Allied troops, never strafed convoys, never challenged the skies. In the end, the math of war favored the side that could replace its losses. And by mid-1944, that side was not Germany. The Korean War proved one thing. Hedge-hopping was no fluke. American pilots brought those same low-level tactics refined over France in 1944 into a new conflict, this time against North Korean and Chinese forces. F-80s and F-84 jets screamed across the Korean countryside at tree level, hitting supply convoys and airfields before the enemy even knew they were there. The speeds had changed. Props were now jets. But the principles, identical: fly low, fly fast, use the terrain, strike first. 2 decades later, the Vietnamese would learn the hard way. F-4 Phantoms and A-7 Corsairs flew low-level interdiction missions along the Ho Chi Minh Trail with brutal efficiency. The terminology evolved. Nap of the Earth flying replaced hedge-hopping, but the DNA remained pure Thunderbolt. And that DNA still exists today. Modern close air support doctrine across NATO, across the U.S. Air Force still, bears the fingerprints of those P-47 pilots. Look at the A-10 Warthog, designed in the 1970s for one job: low altitude, ground attack. It carries everything the Thunderbolt taught. Heavy armor underneath, redundant flight systems, weapons designed for precision against hardened ground targets, training that emphasizes terrain masking and low-level approaches. Even today, Air Force survival schools teach the same truths that HUBZEM's pilots learned the hard way. Altitude gives you visibility, but low altitude gives you surprise. Speed at tree level can be a better defense than maneuverability at 20,000 feet. And the ground itself, if used correctly, is a weapon. Sure, the planes changed. The weapons evolved, but the core concept of using speed and terrain to defeat a superior enemy becoming a goal. Yet, the psychological legacy might be even more powerful than the tactical one. The hedge-hopping campaign shattered the illusion that doctrine is always right. It proved that conventional wisdom can get people killed, that tactics written in peacetime might need to be thrown out in war, and that sometimes the most insane idea is the one that saves lives. HUBZEM was never court-martialed for his unapproved tactics. Instead, he was awarded a Distinguished Service Cross. His legacy wasn't just a record of kills or missions. It was cultural, doctrinal, institutional. The Army Air Forces and, later, the independent Unseen Air Force internalized a lesson that still shapes American air power today. When the cost of doing the same thing becomes unacceptable, you don't just do it harder. You question everything. You give your officers permission to experiment, and you make adaptation part of the doctrine. Walk through the Air Force Museum in Dayton today, and you'll find a P-47 Thunderbolt suspended from the ceiling. The placard talks about high-altitude escort missions and the massive radial engine. It's historically accurate, but it's not the whole story. Because the Thunderbolt became truly dangerous, not when it flew high but when it flew low, when pilots pointed that steel nose at the ground instead of the sky, when it became a hedge-hopping predator that rewrote the rules of air combat, that taught a generation of warriors how to fight not at altitude, at the edge of human reflex, at the place where physics and surprise ruled the skies. 7 months, 50 feet. One radical idea. That's how American pilots broke the Luftwaffe. That's how they helped win the war. The first weeks of captivity were filled with unease, quiet observation, and cautious exchanges as hundreds of Japanese prisoners of war stepped through the barbed wire gates of the American camp. Most arrived in torn, dusty uniforms, the marks of long march, endless island roads, and the exhausting tropical heat still clinging to their bodies. They were weary, uncertain, and unprepared for what awaited them inside. After registration, medical checks, and the issue of basic supplies, they were guided into a large wooden building with pipes running overhead. The sight made many pause in confusion. It was unlike anything they had seen throughout the war. Rows of metal nozzles hung from the ceiling, each with a drain below. The American guards, calm yet firm, signaled for them to remove their clothes and line up. Only then did many realize they were about to wash. For soldiers who had fought across jungles and beaches, bathing had been rare and improvised, often done in rivers or the sea. Soap was a luxury, water a rationed gift. Yet here, under the supervision of their former enemy, they were being offered an organized bath. Whispers spread quickly. Was it real kindness or a test of some kind? The memories of warnings from their officers returned. Tales of cruelty, humiliation, and punishment. Now, standing before these strange metal showers, uncertainty filled the air. The guards repeated their instructions, motioning firmly but without aggression. One by one, the men complied. They stood quietly, the sound of fabric falling to the floor echoing through the room. Then came a sudden hiss. Warm water poured from above, startling everyone. For a brief moment, tension froze them in place. But soon, as the heat touched their skin and the dirt began to wash away, a deep silence took over. Some closed their eyes, others rubbed the soap in disbelief. What began as fear slowly turned into calm. For the first time in months, perhaps years, they felt clean. The sensation of warmth, the smell of soap, and the sound of water washing over them felt almost unreal. When it was over, clean towels awaited, thick, folded, and soft to the touch. Many hesitated before reaching for them, unsure if such comfort was truly meant for them. But it was. To the Americans, it was a routine procedure. To the prisoners, it felt like an impossible luxury. As they left the bathhouse, hair dripping and skin flushed from the heat, a quiet astonishment passed between them. The fear that had gripped their arrival had shifted into confusion, perhaps even a fragile kind of relief. Had their captors truly shown them care instead of cruelty? That first experience in the camp showers stayed with them. It became the moment they began to question everything they had believed about their enemy. A moment, not of humiliation, but of unexpected humanity.